President Trump calls on Senate Republicans to tie the SAVE Act to government spending the day after Senator Mike Lee suggested it right here on Blaze News Tonight. The bill requires proof of U.S. citizenship to vote, with Trump calling on Republicans to make Democrats explain why they're against it. So thanks for watching, Mr. President. AT&T announces almost all of its customer data has been stolen. The company explained, however, that the data did not include the contents of the customers' calls and texts. AT&T disclosed the information was downloaded onto an illegal third-party cloud platform and that at least one suspect has been detained. And despite all the online mockery, Joe Biden's NATO speech may actually have been a silver lining for Joe Biden. We have those stories and so much more. Blaze News Tonight starts right now. Welcome to the chaos. I'm Jill Savage. Today is Friday, July 12th. Joe Biden took the stage in Washington, D.C. last night, only to provide fodder for online trolls and opponents within his party.
I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president.
But Politico says the appearance has Democrats frozen in place as Biden technically did complete his speech. We have a special guest in studio today. Oran McIntyre is the host of the Oran McIntyre Show on Blaze TV. And Oran, we've all seen just the online sound bites, how this big boy could have solidified himself into Biden's position as the party nominee. What did he do last night to potentially get himself there?
Yeah, ultimately, it's crazy that the bar we've set is that he just doesn't fall over in any given press conference. Really, the Democrats are in a terrible place because obviously many people in the party do want to go ahead and push him out. But if he continues to just push this along, if he can just stay in the pocket long enough, eventually it becomes very difficult to go ahead and unseat him. And it does seem like he does have enough momentum. I don't think they're really going to be able to do this.
Well, we will be talking about that more as we go on throughout today's show. But now I want to bring in Chris Bedford, the senior political editor and Washington correspondent for Blaze News. Chris, in your Beltway brief today, you said that Biden's secret strength is in its last leg. So what is that secret strength?
His secret strength is the backup he chose 4 years ago. That's Kamala Harris. That's someone who's not very threatening to him. This is a party that's completely obsessed with identity, with ethnic identity. And here you have a vice president who's a woman, who's the first black vice president, who's the first child of two immigrants to potentially be president since Andrew Jackson, who's a founder of the Democratic Party, but one they don't like to talk about anymore. This should be an historic moment for Democrats to let the old white guy step aside and let Kamala Harris in. But despite all those strengths on paper, according to Democratic policies, she's such a uniquely bad and uniquely lazy politician that they basically had to shelve her. Even when Gavin Newsom was facing a recall in California, they didn't use her, the former senator from California, the vice president from California. No one wanted her there. In the couple weeks since the debate disaster, she's basically only done 4 events, and almost none of them have been in battleground states except for a visit to Las Vegas, where she was picking up checks, essentially, from big party donors. Other places she went was like Park City, Utah, for example, not a state that Biden's competing in. She's been in the background for kind of plotting, potentially, most likely, against her boss, but showing outward loyalty. And Democrats realize that, well, there's a lot of different dream candidates who would do a much better job as the president, or at least as a presidential nominee than she would. There's a lot of different interests in the Democratic Party that would try to push for her as being second in place, as the person who has access to the campaign cash if Joe Biden were to step aside. Now, there's a rumor going around Washington, D.C. right now that on Monday, during Joe Biden's speech at the LBJ Library, he might announce this big historic shift to Kamala Harris. She's going to take it over, first black presidential nominee since Barack Obama, first female, I guess. And that also LBJ is a kind of an interesting place because he stepped aside for the Democratic nomination in 1968 before Chicago and that convention. So we'll see what happens there. I kind of think that this strikes me as more D.C. political nerd dreaming. Joe Biden did a decent enough job on Thursday to actually try to hold on to this thing, but that's the rumor.
Well, we look, Oron, at Kamala Harris. Everybody's trying to put her in there, but is this actually going to be something that the Democrats are going to do or not?
Well, obviously, they have to go ahead and try to make that transition if they make it at all. You can't really skip over her, like he said, because of the DEI politics inside the Democratic Party. You can't go to a Gavin Newsom that breaks their entire narrative. And even though she's incredibly unlikable, she checks all the boxes, which is why she got there in the first place. They were never interested in her as a presidential candidate. They were only interested in her as a running mate that went ahead and validated Joe Biden with the identity politics of the party. So I don't understand if you do manage to get rid of Biden, how you can go to anyone else.
Well, we know that they were always going to be following the money, and we had a headline today that came out that might actually be the thing that changes something, because the New York Times came out and said that major Democrat donors to the largest pro-Biden super PAC have frozen $90 million in pledged donations until Joe Biden steps down. So, Chris, what was your reaction when you saw that this morning?
That's serious for the Democrats. That's scary for the Democrats. Money was their main advantage, money and incumbency. And incumbency has kind of been washed up by the fact that Donald Trump was once president too, and the Democrat Party is kind of pushing back against Biden. However, if I was Joe Biden and I was as stubborn as he is, I would look at those donors and say, what are you going to do? Give your money to Donald Trump? Do you want Donald Trump to be the president? It's kind of like when Republican donors legendarily threatened Richard Nixon. He said, well, why don't you go give it to the socialists I'm running against and don't ever threaten me again. That's the kind of power that a president has. And these mega donors who are threatening to hold that money, I think that they are seriously angry and seriously concerned about Joe Biden. But at the end of the day, if he sticks with it, I would bet that money frees up.
Well, we look at what else is going on in the Democrat Party, and Joe Clyburn insists on Biden. He has one of the best minds, he says right now, Chris. He said that his mistake is just related to stuttering. We are now seeing Democrats clearly on one side or the other, and we can put Clyburn right there in the pro-Biden camp right now, Chris.
Well, that's good for Biden because he almost lost Clyburn, who was literally the chairman of his campaign. The reason why Joe Biden is the president in the first place is because after getting his butt kicked in Iowa and his butt kicked in New Hampshire, James Clyburn and a bunch of other Democrats came out and said, we're not dealing with these wackos who want to open the border and abolish ICE and abolish the police, even though Joe Biden ended up doing basically all of that. He said, we're going to go with the more conservative guy. This is our plan for right now. And he rallied voters in South Carolina for a surprise comeback from Joe Biden. And then you had black and Southern Democrat voters in the primaries after that who shared those ideas, who didn't have those New Hampshire Democrat ideas of backing Pete Buttigieg or whoever was winning at the time in that state. James Clyburn turning on Joe Biden would be a serious problem, but I don't think there's anyone in the country, even the party loyalists, who buy that it's a stutter that makes you confuse Vladimir Putin and Zelensky or Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. Maybe that's part of Joe Biden's old thing. He's been screwing names up for 50 years now, but there are worse signs than that, and we can all see them.
Oh, come on, Joe. Well, it's going to be fun for us poking fun at Joe Biden for the next few weeks, but we are going to be focusing our coverage on the RNC. You are going to be there, and I want to switch gears now because Republicans, there are going to be protesters as well that are reportedly starting to march the security perimeter at the RNC. Julio Rosas is the Blaze Media national correspondent, and he will be joining Chris Bedford in Milwaukee, and he actually is joining us right now to preview all of this. So, Julio, what kind of groups can we expect to see protesting over at the RNC?
Well, it's your typical rainbow coalition of far leftists, although obviously the main focus and a lot of the main attention is about the war in Gaza against Hamas. But also, I think now post-debate and all the turmoil that's in Biden's campaign, I think we're going to see an invigoration in the streets because the leftists who have been so focused on Biden for the past couple of months, they're going to start to think, well, shoot, Trump can actually probably be back in the White House and we're going to have to start focusing on him.
It was interesting because we talked earlier today and you were telling me police are saying that they're not going to tolerate a lot of violence, but they're going to give some leeway before they start cracking down. If I were the police, I wouldn't be going out there letting this known ahead of time.
Yeah. So what I wrote for over at theblaze.com is that yes, the police chief of MPD, he did say that they're not going to tolerate any violence. That there's clear lines that should not be crossed. But, and this is the consequences of a post George Floyd world, they did say that, well, they're going to give some leeway on certain things before a crackdown, because one of the commanders, one of the on-scene commanders who's going to be there, he told a local news station that, well, there's a difference between a non-frozen water bottle being thrown at an officer as opposed to a brick, and in the eyes of the law, that's still considered assault. So I think, if I were to put it in weatherman predictions, I think there's probably about a 30 to 40% chance of anything serious happening. But I think the true test on whether or not the DNC in Chicago is going to be violent is how the same group and same far left coalition is going to act when Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu comes to speak to Congress in Washington, D.C. on July 24th.
Chris, I want to bring you back in here and just give us what you're looking forward to the most next week with the RNC.
The RNC, I'm looking forward to tracking down all the campaign folks. Trump's had an unusual thing where he's got a lot of the policy people here in Washington, D.C., and the folks who are getting ready to staff the next administration. A lot of the campaign folks are spread out or down in Florida, and they're going to be all coming together, this whole group of Republicans, D.C. Republicans, administration Republicans, Congress, Senate, Florida folks, Texas, all over, coming together for the first time in this city. And that's always a good place to learn about new different aspects that I can bring to you and meet new people and try to get the inside scoop on exactly what's going on. And I was concerned that there would be a lot more infighting at this RNC due to the, frankly, imperial nature that the presidency, that the campaign dealt with the party platform. But it seems to have died down. Whether or not the social conservatives continue to push this coming week is something that we're definitely going to be keeping a close eye on as well. But I'm just looking forward to getting in the ground, getting back to Wisconsin, where I've not been since covering the elections in 2020, with Julio to talk to the RNC chairman, talk to senators, talk to congressmen, and record some of those interviews and bring them right here to you.
Oran, do you think there are going to be any big fireworks that we're going to be seeing at the RNC next week?
Obviously, you have to wonder if there'll be anybody trying to push violence, but it's very strange how this whole campaign cycle has played out. At this point, usually you would feel like there had been a lot of back and forth between the candidates, but what we're really just seeing is a lot of wondering, is Joe Biden able to go ahead and do what he needs to do? Will he be replaced? Will Trump be eligible to actually even run? It barely feels like we've even been in the middle of a presidential campaign at this point.
It barely feels like it, but we are actually in the middle of one, and we will continue to be in the middle of that all next week at the RNC, with everybody bringing us coverage here for Blaze News Tonight. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, guys. The Lieutenant Governor of Texas joins us to explain how Biden abandoned Texas after a hurricane. Don't go anywhere. Despite his promise to be a unifying leader, Biden's response to Hurricane Beryl has been to criticize the Texas GOP. The White House occupant told the Houston Chronicle that he couldn't track down Governor Abbott or Lieutenant Governor Patrick to deliver a federal response. But Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick took to X saying, quote, "The White House documents show that he terminated the emergency declaration on the same day it was issued, leaving Texas unable to claim the reimbursement for expenses occurred after the declaration was terminated." Lieutenant Governor Patrick is here to set the record straight. So, Lieutenant Governor Patrick, what is the current progress on the recovery efforts right now for Hurricane Beryl?
So first of all, for those who don't know, I'm acting governor whenever the governor is out of state, and he is in Asia. So I've been acting governor all last week, preparing for the storm, and this week as we recover, and will continue to be. So early on, Hurricane Beryl looked like it was going to Mexico, but it was in the Gulf. And anyone in Texas knows when a storm is in the Gulf, a hurricane, it can end anywhere no matter the forecast. So the storm kept moving towards Houston. I was in the emergency center in Austin Friday, all day Friday, Sunday, and Monday, about 12 or 15 hours a day. And so we didn't need Joe Biden and what he was offering before the storm. Texas has the most complete storm preparation emergency system of anyone in the country. So we had all the generators, we had all the ready-to-eat meals, we had our water, we had our ice, etc. So that's number one. So I wasn't looking for it on Sunday or Monday. We're just preparing. So Joe Biden says that he couldn't find Greg Abbott or myself. Well, first of all, he has Greg Abbott's cell number. Secondly, he may not have my cell number, but the FBI can find anyone in about 15 minutes if the president wants them. But more importantly, the FEMA people who are his federal employees were working next to me 12, 15 hours a day. I talked to them every day. All he had to do was call them and hand the phone to me or tell them to get my number. So first of all, saying we were hiding or he couldn't find it is baloney, a lie. Then he called me on Tuesday and I asked for a specific declaration. He granted it. We were very happy with that. He went on Twitter then and announced an even higher level declaration because he apparently forgot what he had agreed to. And then so we had to, send another form for that declaration. We were fine because it was even better than we got the first time. But here's the bottom line. Yesterday, or late last evening, we look at the White House documents, the FEMA documents, and on the day he granted it, on July 9th, he ended it. So any new money coming or new expenses coming after that would not have been covered. Now, FEMA says, and by the way, we love FEMA. The people are great, but it's been politicized and weaponized like no other president in history of this government agency that works with states. And so everyone in FEMA knows what happened. He forgot what he did. They had to change what he did, and then he ended what he did. And they said, well, we can extend it, we can extend it. Well, he can, but number one, we have all the forms, all the documents that show he agreed, and we asked for a continuing document, not one to end on the day he gave it. And number two, for all 121 counties in our disaster area. And it turns out he cut that down to 67 without telling us either.
So is Texas going
Total
to get
lie.
what they need ultimately from this federal administration?
Yes, so we will get what we need the way that he ordered it without telling anyone, was we would only get paid for our expenses up to the day of the storm, the day he gave me the document, or the day after the storm on July 9th. So now I've already made another request, a new request for continuing. I've made a new request for individual assistant that's called AI as opposed to PI, which is public assistance. So the idea that here's what's the treachery of it. He says he's looking for Abbott and I and can't find us. Total lie. He could have found us. Number two, we were hiding in plain sight, you might say. We were right there. Number two, he makes a big deal out of giving us this declaration that I asked for, and I was very professional. I thanked him. I tweeted out. We appreciate it. I mentioned it in the public news conference. He asked me to do that. I did, and then immediately after, he's attacking me and attacking Governor Abbott for slowing down things, which is just the opposite of what happened. And then he comes back and ends up canceling it on the day he gave it to me. So total dishonesty, total politicizing what should be an event that should never be politicized. And when I say, when he says we delayed things, here's the truth. Whenever a governor applies for a declaration of emergency, a disaster, the average in Texas for the last 20 years has been 16 days. I got mine in a 3-minute phone call in 1 day. So nothing was delayed. We got it faster than ever. It was all politics for him. And look, here's the key thing. I'm worried about saving lives. I'm worried about getting power on to another million people who still don't have it. This was a devastating storm. I shouldn't have to play politics with him, but I'm not going to let Joe Biden come out and blame our emergency response team, blame Texas, blame the governor, myself, for something that he created only for politics. We didn't need what he had. We'll need it as we go down the road, and we're happy to get it down the road, but we're well prepared. We didn't need it Sunday, Monday, or Tuesday, and into Wednesday. We were able to fulfill everything that everybody needed in every county that asked us instantly. We work faster than the federal government, by the way.
Well, Texas likes to think that they lead the way, and they do in many regards. So what is Texas's role in the importance of the nation and as we move further in the right? Look,
we are important because we're the biggest Republican state in the country. There are a few Republican states, you might say they're a little redder, in terms of the legislative body, but we control all the statewide offices. We control the Senate. We control the Texas House, although we have a rhino speaker, so that's a challenge sometimes. But beyond that, when we make a decision in Texas, the biggest state, the second biggest state in the country, 30 million people and growing, and the biggest red state in the country with the most electoral votes, other states watch. We have the ability to do more research. We have the ability, and by the way, when we see a good idea from another state, we follow them too. We're happy to see a great idea from another Republican state. But what we do in Texas is significant. I mean, our budget is $160 billion a year. Some states' budgets are somewhere in the single digits, or 10 or 12 billion a year. There's just no comparison. So whatever we leverage, whatever bills we pass, whatever Supreme Court decisions back our decisions, impact the entire country. And we're proud to lead the way. We see it as being on our watch that Texas is the America that all America used to be. And we're glad to partner with all of our red states, mid-sized, big, small. It doesn't matter. We're one to save our country, because that's what's on the line in November.
Lieutenant Governor Patrick, thank you so much for joining us, and we will be trying to follow along as those million people are still without power. I know that Governor Abbott has demanded an investigation to that as well, so thanks for joining us.
Yes, as I have, so thank you. Thank you.
Pro-lifers respond to the terrorist label given to them by the Pentagon. Stay tuned. The DoD casually gave two pro-life groups terrorist designations during a briefing at Fort Liberty, North Carolina. That puts organizations like Choose Life in the same category as ISIS. Steve Baker is an investigative journalist for Blaze News and wrote an article about this unbelievable development at theblaze.com. So, Steve, how did the Pentagon justify giving a terrorist group distinction to a nonviolent opponent of abortion?
Well, actually, they're not justifying it. As a matter of fact, they're denying it now. And that was the predicted response by the individuals that we interviewed about this particular story in this particular case. We were told by Sam Shoemate that, in fact, they would respond in this manner, that Fort Liberty, formerly Fort Bragg out of North Carolina, would respond just this exact way and say, oh, this was an accident. This was a slide that was produced by somebody here at the garrison. It wasn't supposed to be in there. It'll never happen again. We'll discipline him and retrain him, and it will take care of it all. But we're getting more whistleblowers coming back to us right now. Myself and Joe Hanneman, who co-wrote this story with me, they are telling us already that this slide is not only not a mistake, not just something that was created there by the garrison at Fort Liberty, but in fact that this is a nationwide program, and we're having more soldiers, more whistleblowers coming forward and sending us this information from all over the country.
Steve, it's funny when they try and say that this is a mistake, this slide, oops, it accidentally got in there. But it's interesting that these mistakes really only seem to go one way every single time.
Always. It's exactly the same way. But this is what's really, really frightening, Jill, is that this is showing us a much, much darker, much deeper actual conspiracy to fundamentally change America. Because here's what's happening right here. Originally, we had these groups being designated as extremists. And then we get the designation of DVEs, domestic violent extremists. Then they take us over to the, domestic terrorist label. But once they start labeling groups as terror organizations, and this is the DOD. Now, this is a DOD, Department of Defense, talking about domestic American-based groups, organizations, 501c3s, calling them terror organizations. First of all, what in the hell is the Department of Defense doing looking at domestic groups anyway? Just start there. Ask yourself that question, and it gets frightening. Take it to the next level when they start designating them as domestic organizations. And this is what Sam Shoemate told me, 21-year veteran of the Army, just retired last year, basically running a surreptitious kind of whistleblower program himself while he was still in the Army, post-COVID regime. And what he informed me, as we shared in this article, is that he believes that this is an indication that there is a plan at some point to move these groups into becoming targets of our military. Why else present this to soldiers in this manner?
Okay, so we talk about the different leveling up of all of these designations, everything that you go back to the Obama administration. He had the FBI, he had the IRS under Lois Lerner charting conservative groups. And then you get the FBI even recently just saying, oh, you know, if you're a Catholic and you're going to Latin Mass, we're going to have you on an extremist list. Joe Biden himself was saying the mega extremists are the domestic terrorists as well. And now, as you're saying, Steve, it gets all the way up to the Department of Defense. At that point, like, there's not very many levels of government to go above this.
No, there's not. And you know, we have constitutional protections from our military moving and operating against American citizens, American organizations. And this is a frightening development that we've seen here. This really needs to be investigated. If Congress is going to do anything for the remainder of this tour, investigate this and do something about it, because this is something that is particularly important for all Americans to understand and know about. Just because you have a group you don't like, we're not talking about a militia group here. We're not talking about the Patriot Front. We're not talking about the KKK. It doesn't matter. Even the military is not supposed to move against those groups. We're talking about groups that their only function is to defend life. Now, you can agree with abortion or not, but does that raise them to the level of being a target of our military?
Steve, we know that they have been using things like the vaccine and connections to different organizations like the NRA to attempt to purge a lot of people who might be sympathetic to President Trump, the conservative cause. How heavily does that play into this fact that now the DOD is teaching soldiers to go ahead and possibly go after American citizens? When you see that shift, purging so many of the right out of the military, you see the encouragement of more illegal immigrants or immigrants moving into the military. What does this mean for the military?
Well, they clearly used COVID and the COVID regime and the lockdowns and, of course, the required vaccinations as a tool and a weapon to decapitate the military. And they were able to move out the best of the best. They were able to move out our strong candidates, our constitutional believing, oath protecting, oath defending constitutional military leaders, and they were able to move them out. It, of course, started before that. It started under the Obama administration when he started the decapitation strategy of not only the military, but also the intelligence community, the FBI, et cetera, et cetera. And this is now really focused on the military because, look, we always believed, those of us who have kind of war gamed these things out in our own minds have always believed that at the end of the day, that the military would be strong enough to stand up against these cultural Marxists, these neo-Marxists, but that's not happening anymore. The military itself is all about DEI. It is all about the cultural Marxism that had already long ago infected the CIA, the FBI, the DOJ. And once you start firing generals like Obama did by the hundreds and replacing them with leftist strategists, and by strategists, we're not talking about very good military strategists. We're talking about cultural strategists to change the landscape of the military, then this is what we get.
Steve, pro-lifers aren't the only prosecutors getting prosecuted, as the January 6th probationer is trying to appeal his disinformation monitoring order that was on his computer. Now, I've never heard of this, Steve. So what is a disinformation monitoring order?
Look, this is one of the more absurd January 6th case developments. And I've been shouting from the rooftops for years now, for over 3 years, that January 6th, its primary narrative loss that because the right got beat really bad. The left won a huge narrative victory, maybe the largest narrative victory in the history of our country over what happened on January 6th. But what they have used that now as a cudgel to attack the First Amendment, to attack speech. And in fact, everything that's happening in these trials, just a few blocks from where I'm sitting right now at the district courthouse here in D.C., the most important thing that's taking place in those trials are the judicial attacks by the Department of Justice and by these courts who are part of the judiciary against speech. And this particular attack right here by Judge Walton against the defendant, Daniel Goodwin, is literally he's making up law as he goes. He's telling him he cannot use a computer, he cannot use the internet, he can't use his right to free speech because he was walked inside the building, the Capitol building on January 6th for 36 seconds. He took a plea deal to entering a restricted space. That's all he's convicted for. And for 36 seconds, he gets sentenced to 60 days in prison. I mean, this is how ridiculous this is, how over the top it is. And now the judge puts on this speech restriction, which the appellate court shot down and said, no, you got to, Judge Walton, you've got to look at this again because you overreached, you overstepped. You did not prove that you were putting on this particular client or this particular defendant. You didn't prove that the computer has any relationship to his crime because it didn't. And it also it goes too far and it takes away his constitutionally given rights in your penalties against him. Well, guess what the judge did? The judge got it back and he reimposed it again. And this is what's happening in these courts right now. Even when we get a ruling, whether we get a ruling at the Supreme Court, like over the 1512 obstruction of an official proceeding charge against 355 January 6 defendants, basically what the courts have done is just flip the middle finger, and what the Department of Justice has done is just flip the middle finger at the higher courts and tell them, this is what we're going to do, whether you like it or not.
Whether you like it or not. Thanks so much for joining us, Stephen. If you think what he says is bad, well, stay with us because a group of managerial elites could be trying to take over the world. It's not science fiction. It's coming up next. In his book, Total State, Oram McIntyre explains how countries like America become authoritarian states, not in spite of being liberal democracies, but because they're democracies. Well, get ready to swallow more of the black pill because in his recent piece for theblaze.com, he explains how international organizations are trying to create global managerial revolution to take over the world. Oran, what exactly is the managerial revolution?
Well, in the 1930s, most people think of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany and the United States as radically different governments, and of course they are. But during the Industrial Revolution, we had a scaling up of society, and we had to go ahead and factor in mass production and mass consumption into the way that everybody managed their societies. And so the managerial revolution was the realization that most societies placed a lot of their function into these mass bureaucratic organizations, and that really changes the way that we do business, putting a lot of power not into the Constitution or the formal articles that we believe govern things like the United States, but instead into these bureaucracies, which we can now see as the deep state and other entities seem to run the country, even when someone like Joe Biden is checked out.
So you talk about managerial revolutions and managerial power. Can you give us some explanation and examples of what you mean by this?
Sure, on a regular basis, we see that decisions are not made at the executive level, but instead are distributed through experts. So, for instance, we know that someone like Donald Trump was elected to be president of the United States, but when the pandemic hits, it doesn't feel like he's even in charge, right? Instead, we get somebody like Anthony Fauci. Nobody remembers voting for Anthony Fauci. No one can find somewhere in the articles of the Constitution where he has the power that he wields, but ultimately everyone goes ahead and jumps in and does whatever he says once he's been placed in charge. This is the power of the managers. Even though we have these formal elected officials, it's actually the experts that rule whenever their particular specialization comes into play.
So you get the big state, and we see that in so many different ways in our lives, right? We see a godless state. We see the obsession with targeting children, going the state versus the parents, who has more of that control, flooding the border to erase the culture. Are these all part of it as well?
Absolutely. The managerial regime understands that the particularities of a given people, their families, their communities, their churches, these are all things that people give loyalty to. And if they're giving loyalty to those things, they can't give loyalty to the state. So a big part of the managerial state is breaking down those organic institutions, the things that make us who we are, that we actually understand as human beings, and instead make us all conform to what they want to build as experts. They want to reprogram people, and to do that, they have to break down things like the family.
It's almost just more disheartening when you hear that. That, of course, like we kind of know that this is what they're doing, but we want to know that on a subconscious level. I don't want to think about them actually going through, planning out, trying to figure out, okay, how can we dismantle the family and all of the other things that you're just mentioning here.
Yeah, and ultimately there's kind of a symbiosis here, right? A lot of people buy into the idea that experts can go ahead and tell them what to do, and therefore it's not that they have to plan top down every piece of how they're going to break down the family, but it simply means that we go ahead and rely on these experts in situations we shouldn't. That's why parents go ahead and believe experts when it comes to how they should raise their children, rather than going with the traditions that their family and their churches have had for millennia.
Yeah, you go through and you go, okay, what did you learn at school today? And they just list off all of these different things. And you're thinking, okay, I thought that I was doing a good job by sending my kid to school. But that's really where they start. This is the first touch point that they have because they're just small children that can be molded.
And they have this stranglehold. It's not just, of course, when children are young. It's all through their education. You get to the college and people have to send their kids to college for these credentials. They understand that that's an important part of making sure they get good jobs, they can find good people to marry, they can become productive citizens. But they also realize they're handing their children over to these indoctrination centers. And so everyone feels trapped. They know that the credential is actually a part of the college, even though that college is also going to turn the child into some kind of woke narcissist.
So I look at it and I say, okay, we have laws on the books, right? We have the Constitution, we have the Bill of Rights, but it seems like they're changing things without actually changing the writings, the laws themselves. Can you go through what we've been looking at from the time of FDR to today?
That's right. People like FDR went ahead and invested so much power into these executive agencies, but really we didn't do a lot of changing what the Constitution said. Article 2 didn't suddenly create all of these things, but slowly over time, the Congress stopped legislating and instead went ahead and said, okay, the experts are the ones that decide all of this stuff. They're the ones that have the special knowledge. And so we need to go ahead and make these changes over time. And what happens is that we lose more and more of our influence. We, the people, the voters, there's very little checks on what these agencies do, even though, again, no one passed any amendments that put these people in charge.
And governments have secret deals. We've seen from Elon Musk. He had a quote on X saying that the European Commission offered X an illegal secret deal. If we quietly censored speech without telling anyone, they would not define it. They would fine us. Other platforms accepted the deal and X did not. So, Oran, how important is the control of that flow of information?
Oh, it's absolutely critical because, of course, popular sovereignty is what legitimates our government, right? We believe that it's the voice of the people that give our elite class power. But the elite class doesn't want to turn over that power. They're not going to let a little thing like an election push them out of power.
Why would they do that?
Exactly.
That's just a small thing.
They know what's best. And so what do they have to do? They have to manipulate the minds of the people. And how do you do that? You limit or control the information. And so that's why they're so heavily invested in censorship. That's why the misinformation push has been so big, because the internet has radically shattered the monopoly they used to have on information. And they're very scared about the fact that people like us can go ahead and talk about what's happening, and they can't put their thumb on the scales all the time.
So we see the United States, we just talked about the European Commission. So why is this all leading to globalism? Why isn't taking over one country enough?
Well, again, the managerial elite, they draw their power from these massified bureaucratic institutions. And the larger they become, the more they can open up and bring more people inside. That creates the efficiency and the miracle that they kind of offer, that you're going to live better lives, that you're going to produce more. And that's why they want to move outside, not just the United States, but then to the world. The more that they can connect different societies, different people to this managerial network, the wider their power base becomes and the more they can control.
How do we push back?
Well, we have to get local. We have to return the country to what it was originally, a federal system where the states and the communities hold much more of the power. Over time, we've eroded so many of these protections. The 9th and 10th Amendment of the Constitution barely exist at this point, but that's not what the founders wanted. And if we continue down this road, the globalization will only get worse.
It's funny, the further away we get from what the founders wanted, the worse it all gets.
Absolutely.
Well, we are going to come right back after this because Hollywood goes from massaging Biden's shoulders to pushing him out the door. That's coming up next. Biden used to appear on late night talk shows like Seth Meyers or Stephen Colbert for a layup interview. However, the tone in Hollywood has become increasingly unfavorable against the Democrat.
There was no real primary. Biden ran against Dean Phillips. That's not even a real person.
The problem here is that I think there's a form of elder abuse going on here.
It is possible handing leadership to a younger generation is the right thing for the greater goodest.
For the greater goodest. Christian Toto is a columnist for Blaze News. Christian, even George Clooney is, a devout liberal. He's calling for Joe Biden to bow out of the race so the Democrats can find a replacement. So what's with this shift in tone here now?
It's a miracle. It's so weird that it happened overnight. I mean, Clooney, yeah, the debate just changed everything, and all the lies, all the misdirection, all the cheap fake conversations abruptly dried up. And now it's time to scramble. It's time for a plan B. And that's what Hollywood and most media outlets are trying to do. So, if you're working the late night circuit, you're a propagandist, but at the same time, you can't ignore that debate. You can't ignore what we've seen in recent weeks. And that's why they've had a change of heart.
Usually Hollywood is so much of a follower. They're always just drinking whatever Kool-Aid happens to be thrown out there. Why do you think this preference cascade suddenly happened? Did it just become uncool for him to be out front, or did they see something in Biden that they don't like?
No, I don't think it's a cool thing. I think it's out of necessity. For years now, Bill Maher has been critiquing the left. I think because at his heart, he wants the Democrats to win, and he knows if he critiques them gently, they may change course and wise up. And I think that's what's happening with comedians in Hollywood and Biden right now. They're trying to say, hey, old Joe, we gonna shuffle off here because we need a plan B now, or we're going to lose to President Trump. So without that, the status quo is unacceptable. So they have to do something. That's why it's happening now. That's why the marching orders are new. I wish Saturday Night Live was operating right now. They're on their summer break, but it would be fascinating for a show that has basically had hands-off treatment of Biden to suddenly say, oh my gosh, we may have a problem here. But, September's a long ways away, and that's when the show comes back.
There are $14 million that people in Hollywood wish that this had all come a few weeks ago because George Clooney had his fundraiser. And then we get all of this shift in tone. So what is the biggest offense to you that you've seen so far, right? We've seen George Clooney. We've seen Michael Douglas. We see Michael Moore. Who's the worst of the worst right now, Christian?
I think when you lose Stephen Colbert, I think that's when it's game over. And I think the fact we've watched him for about 3 or 4 years now, basically ignore Biden. He'll make an old age crack now and then. That's about as tough as he gets. But he really hammered Biden. And, he said something like, he debated as well as Abe Lincoln if you dug him up right now. I mean, those are tough jokes. And the fact that he's been so hands-off and so glib and so willing to look the other way, and all of a sudden he's got the knives out, I think that's the most severe turn. I can't imagine being in his audience and thinking, hey, wait a minute, I paid tickets for the Colbert Show. What's happening right now?
You mentioned Abe Lincoln. Netflix has a hot take on one of our country's most beloved and renowned presidents. Take a look.
He is considered a sacred figure by both Republicans and Democrats.
He led the nation through its greatest crisis.
He's on our currency. We build monuments to him.
He's the greatest president the United States has ever had.
Today, the big question that people are asking is, was Abraham Lincoln gay?
Is that the question that everyone is asking? Okay, well, we do need to give some credit where credit is due because Oran McIntyre called this a year ago. I don't know how, but he did. So maybe you gave Netflix the idea. I don't know. But on a real note, is there any possibility that Abraham Lincoln was actually gay? What are we doing here?
Yeah, well, when I had some friends, the good old boys, on my podcast, they predicted that ultimately it would be important for the media to focus on the idea of Lincoln as a gay man. That would go ahead and update him in the mythos. That would give him some kind of justification because, otherwise he's a white guy, so it's not very good. You need some reason for him to be part of the DEI Olympics. But it's good to know that the Lincoln Project ended up being more historically correct than the 1619 Project, so that's good.
Christian, yes or no, Abe Lincoln, gay or not gay?
Well, right now there's a very woke person in the middle of tearing down a Lincoln statue, and he stopped, so he doesn't know. It's funny. If this had come out maybe 10 years ago, I might give it a little bit more gravitas. But the fact that it's happening now, that this documentary is coming soon in our culture, in this moment, grain of salt hardly qualifies. Maybe if you take a grain of salt, you cut it into equal pieces, then I think you can use that as a judge or a barometer about what's going on.
Oran, the first sentence of one of these articles was Abraham Lincoln, the original log cabin Republican. I think that they're trying so hard. They're stretching so many different things. But what's your take?
Yeah, the Netflixification of history is just ongoing, right? Every one of these dramas is trying to replace historical figures with someone of color or having a different sexual orientation. It's incredibly important for them to rewrite our history.
Christian, one expert summed it up and said that Lincoln is probably sleeping in the same bed with more men than women. Well, I could go out there and be an expert on anything and say, well, this was probably true. He probably was doing all of this. This is the state of journalism in America. This is what we're getting right now, Christian.
You know, I think the term expert has taken a beating in the last few years. Deservedly so. It doesn't look like it's getting any better. If you trust an expert now, that's on you.
Oron, trusting experts. You're a huge fan of trusting experts.
Obviously incredibly dangerous. It's a travesty that history is taking the hit here. If there's one thing we should all be able to agree on, it's what the past is and how it shapes us. And they understand that, which is why it's so important for them to insert their favorite narrative into all of these events and go ahead and change who our leaders were.
So we look at this event in particular, and you're talking, Christian, you're joking that they might be tearing down a statue right now. And it's funny to think about, but this is the reality. They are trying to take our history from us and change everything in real time. And this is going all through Hollywood. We're letting it happen through storytelling and different narratives. So how dangerous could that be?
Well, you know, I think if you take it on a case-by-case basis, it's not a big deal, but collectively, oh, yes, it is. And a fun example is the Snow White remake that's happening in Hollywood with Disney. You know, the star Rachel Zegler was talking about the project. He said, well, you remember the first film, that was so dated and antiquated. We don't like that. We're going to make it better. There's something weird and consistent about trying to say the culture, the past, things that we revere. No, you're wrong. That was all garbage. What we're doing right now, that's what matters. So I think you can take each individual situation and maybe kind of just push it aside and think it's not a big deal. But it really is. It does matter. And there's a reason this energy exists to wipe out the past. I mean, you can learn from the past, but wiping it out, there's a different agenda afoot, I think.
Christian, thanks so much for joining us today. Oron McIntyre, thank you for coming in studio and spending the entire evening with me. Be sure to check out the Oron McIntyre Show. And what can people find when they do go and see your podcast?
Well, I try to go ahead and use the historical thinkers, the political theorists of the past, and apply what they said to what we're seeing today, hoping to add a little bit of depth to the day-to-day analysis when it comes to politics.
And when they do, it's going to be all about The Total State, your book.
Absolutely. The Total State is very important. It draws from all of these thinkers, ties it together in managerial theory.
That's so great that you're out there, that you're doing that, and you're doing it right here on Blaze TV. We are so excited to have you here for the show today. Now, you can check out this show and all of the Blaze News Tonight shows coming up on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe to our channel. It's youtube.com/Blaze News Tonight. Be sure to hit the bell for notifications so you don't miss any of our episodes and breaking news that we have coming your way. Next week, it's a huge week. We will be covering the RNC all for you here on Blaze News Tonight.